Great. Welcome everyone to the third session. So we're going to start our session today by just going over some of the model assumptions, because we've already discussed occupancy. We actually did a trial data collection. So we want to start this session by getting our brains a little bit rolling before we go into some analysis. And I just want to bring you back to this quote that we shared at the beginning of class. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So it's important to understand the assumptions of our models, to have a really clear understanding, and then we can really interpret the models and see if they're actually applicable. For example, if we have a snow leopard and we want to convert it into a model, we must assume it's a snow leopard. It can't be a tiger, right? If we assume it's a tiger, then we've got it all wrong. And the same thing, if we assume it's a house cat, the model's all wrong. So I think it's important to just go through the assumptions and check in with ourselves whenever we use occupancy in our different contexts, whether we meet those assumptions or how we can address some of the assumptions we don't meet, because there are ways to do that as well. Kustub, I don't know if you want to write on your screen, because sometimes my annotation, but if anyone wants to write in the chat or the mic some assumptions they remember from the previous classes about occupancy. We touched upon some of them at the end of class last time. You're on mute, Kustu.
Okay. Yes, I found the annotation option. There we go. Right. Bring it on, people. What do you think are the assumptions of occupancy modeling? And again, please pop.
Closure. So, yes.
Okay, so Nilofer, if you could please elaborate a little more within sampling units or during sampling period. So these can have two different connotations. Which ones do we assume? Population closure.
Kustub, I don't see your notes. Are they on?
They should be.
Now
they come in a while. Okay. During sampling period. Well done. Thank you. That's a good point. So I'm just going to.
Great. And then we also have Ranjana saying spatial independence.
Spatial independence.
So again, at what scale, Ranjana? Similar question to what Kustub asked Nilufar.
Yeah, spatial independence of. If you could elaborate, that would help us.
Between sampling points. So, okay, between survey repeats, I guess.
Okay, so just one add-on point to that, Ranjana. In case we have it, there are ways to deal with it, right? What we are really looking at here, even with the population closure within sampling units, that's the ideal scenario. But if we violate it, there is a way around it. Similarly, spatial independence, if it is not there between sampling replicates, there is a way to deal with it, which we discussed very briefly, which is called spatially autocorrelated or spatially correlated surveys. But so that's the reason. Let me just write it anyway.
Yeah, and then Chloe also says animals must not be scared away and attracted to observer. So that is also another version of spatial, non-spatial independence. Because if it's like a trap happy animal or a trap shy animal, because the first detection affects the following detections, right? So then therefore they're not independent. So that can be seen as under spatial independence.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is great. Great point.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Sorry, I
false
can't.
positives. Yes, Helena, that is another assumption. No false positives, which again, like Kustup started to share last time, and I think we might share in the final session, Kustup. There
Yeah.
are ways to deal with this
Mm-hmm.
in some occasions, but it depends what kind of data you collect and how you.
Absolutely.
And the
Absolutely.
best way to deal with it is really to
Avoid.
prepare and have
Yeah.
a good model in place initially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And detection consistency. So this, I think, Helena, can you elaborate on this? So what you mean by that? And we can, because I think you're on something there. You're very close.
Yeah, I think that was regarding the covariates.
Okay, yes. And I think, yeah, that is another assumption. So assuming that we take into account the different heterogeneity in detection or occupancy through covariates. Otherwise, the assumption is, so it's assuming that there's no non-heterogeneity in our data that we haven't taken into account.
Yeah, I would think that that would be really hard though in all of the units to have consistency with that data collection. That's got to be really hard.
Yeah, so in general, if you can plan it, to avoid differences, for example, in the way you collect your data. So there's more similarities between that, because in this case is particularly important in terms of affecting detection. So if you don't take into account important covariates that affect detection, this can really underestimate your population occupancy. So I think if you really think about, okay, what affected my detection and you test for those, it is possible. Kustup, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's a good point. Try to be as consistent as possible, but as you yourself say, Elena, will not be able to maintain that. And in that case, what we do is we try to quantify, or we try to qualify whatever variations are being incurred, and that's how we should be able to work around it. So try to collect as much data as possible about the potential causes that may lead to that inconsistency, or that may influence the variability in either your detection or the species' distribution. So I think the point remains that the more information you can collect, relevant information, the more you have the options of modeling them. Great. Any other points? Chloe says, in general, try not to violate the assumption of monotonicity of the detection function. Yes, again, a good point, Chloe. But again, as some of you guys were discussing last time, if there is a variable, if there is a response which is not linear and it's increasing and then decreasing, and think about it this way, there was a study by a colleague of ours who was exploring the impact of garbage on Fox distribution. And it's quite fascinating that initially you would detect more foxes in areas where there were garbage, or let's say there were more foxes in areas where there was garbage. But beyond a certain point, then dogs would come in, and then dogs would become a deterrent. So the foxes, even if they were there, you wouldn't get to see them because they would be more elusive. So here, it's completely out of your control, but there is a response which is first increasing and then decreasing. So you need to, if there is something of that sort that's happening, you need to be ready to model it and test it. I mean, there's nothing that you cannot test, and that's the beauty of the modeling process. That if you're doing a rigorous assessment, a biological and ecological assessment of the scenario, then you might actually be able to model these variations. But let me still write it down.
Great. So Gustav, I've got some nice graphics. I don't know if they're nice to show
Sure.
some of these
Of course.
assumptions quickly.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Of course.
Yeah, so I'll just show, so I think we did cover all of the assumptions, but just to make sure everyone was on the same page, whoa, I'm gonna clear the annotation.
Wait, just save it first, please.
Yeah,
Save it.
it's saved.
Okay, done. Great.
We're recording everything.
Nice.
Can you clear, erase?
I'll do that.
There it is.
There we go.
So just to go over some of the assumptions, just to make sure everyone is on the same page about some of these. So when we talk about closure, we really are talking about at the species level. That's just something to highlight. So it's not the individual level. So it assumes that the species is present or always absent during the duration of your survey period. And just so you know, as long as there is one individual present during the whole time, even if there are individuals that leave and come, the assumption generally is met, because you can assume that immigration is random. And this could then potentially less affect detection. So so those are as another assumption, that we assume it's more random movement of the individual. If not, then we try to consider that in our model. And these are just two questions to kind of consider when you're doing your survey: is how long does my entire survey period have to be to try to ensure there is closure? For example, if you're doing camera trapping of snow leopards to do occupancy, you might not want to leave them out for an entire year, because snow leopards are going to give birth, or there might be some snow leopards that die, right? Under the assumption of closure. And it also think between time periods, what is suitable, because the assumption also varies depending on how you collect the data. So if you're noting just the presence of carnivore signs, then we assume that the signs will always be there during the entire survey period. So not some signs will disappear during that survey period. So that's also important to consider. Anything, last things to add, Kostub, about closure? Good. Okay, and then the one we talked about, which was independence, and this is if a survey is repeated, you're not going to influence the next survey, because that would be lack of independence. So if you, for example, redid the eights experiment, and you knew where all the eights were on the next one because it was the same one as the previous, then you potentially would be biasing one of your replicates. And another example, as Chloe said, is if a snow leopard is trap happy or shy, this influences future detection histories, right? So that's important to consider, but you can use a covariate to deal with that. So you shouldn't be worried if that is something you're worried about. And also what Kustub mentioned, you can deal with correlation between repeats. And there's this great example in 2010 by Heinz et al., who looked at tigers on trails. And I made this beautiful graphic to try to explain this. So if a snow leopard is walking along this path, but your survey is here, and you use these different repeats as repetition, you see that the snow leopards walked along your path for 2 repeats, right? So whether the snow leopard is here is influenced by whether it was captured here, because it's just continuing its path. So therefore, you will mark 2 snow leopards here, and that will be correlated. But you can account for that in the model with the Heinz et al. Model, because they assume that there's a higher probability of detecting snow leopards in the next repeat if you initially detected it, similarly to the trap response. Just to explain that just a little bit more, but check out this paper. I think it's quite interesting. And finally, what Helena said, the no unmodeled heterogeneity, we do assume they're constant or a function of covariance. But this is especially important for detection because this could underestimate occupancy. And then no false absences. But this again, because this could really severely overestimate your estimate, but there are different ways to deal with this that we'll touch in the next sessions. So yeah, so I love assumptions, so that's why I wanted to make sure that we went over them. But we can move on to analysis. Over to you, Kustu.
Thank you, Justine. I think that was a really nice and concise coverage of what we mean when we're dealing with occupancy surveys. In fact, some of the points that you highlight, I think it'll be great when we go through them. And if you could please stop, or others could stop us to discuss how we are violating, or we are adjusting, or we are kind of accommodating certain assumptions or violations. All right, so let me see if I can
That's a
share.
great point, Kusub. So I think with these assumptions, you don't always assume you have to meet them all completely. There are ways to deal with it. It's just to be aware, okay, am I dealing with it appropriately?
Exactly. Absolutely. Thanks, Justine, for highlighting that. And